Capcom's premier action RPG series, Monster Hunter, advertises all that it needs to in its title: big game hunting with monsters. The fifth installment of the series, World, and its DLC, Iceborne, sees you go toe-to-toe against these powerhouses of nature among the unexplored lands of the New World, all for the sake of ecological research. Narratively, you are presented as something of an ethical hunter, someone who hunts for the sake of environmental study and protection. This aspect is never called into question, nor is it ever challenged. No character will ever stand in the way of you and the giant dinosaur with explosive boxing gloves, because narratively, there is an understanding that is for the benefit of nature. However, between monster parts being the main form of obtaining new weapons and armor, to the requirement of hunting a single species repeatedly for rewards, the core gameplay loop depicts that of a selfish style of hunting, one that looks like poaching and trophy hunting. This creates a dissonance between gameplay and narrative. How then does the gameplay of Monster Hunter World showcase you, the player, as an ethical hunter? The answer, I believe, lies within the mechanics of the monster and how they condition the player to behave. Through Hunicke's MDA model, we can see how a monster's use of sequential action, the physical design, and the game's unique way of communicating health all conditions the player into practicing some core aspects of ethical hunting. Hi there, my name is Tammy, and this is the Ethics of the Hunt in Monster Hunter World. To establish our basis, we will be using Robert Hunicke et al.'s MDA, a formal approach to game design and game research, to see how the design of the monsters influence the player into a playstyle that's similar to ethical hunting. In more specific terms, the mechanics of the monster's actions influence the dynamic of the player to adopt a certain playstyle that then inspires an aesthetic that feels less like poaching and more like being an ethical hunter. One term that I want to introduce is ethical hunting. This is a concept that involves the practice of respecting the hunt and the land. For this video, we will be primarily focusing on three parts: respecting the monster, remaining knowledgeable about the ecosystem, and the practice of efficient shot placement. The monsters of Monster Hunter World utilize the animation principle of anticipation in conjunction with sequential action in order to condition you into practicing the ethical hunting tenet, respect. The animation principle of anticipation is a core part of telegraphing attacks in order to fairly communicate to players incoming attacks from the boss. However, the core issue of telegraphing attacks is that finding a balance between too much or too little anticipation is a difficult process, along with a second issue of readability versus predictability. Monster Hunter solves both of these issues through the use of sequential action, or the use of one animation immediately following after another. While some monsters can have singular attacks with long moments of anticipation, some also utilize a gameplay mechanic where certain smaller attacks serve as telegraphs for other massive hits. The Nergigante will slam its massive horns into the ground before shooting the spikes on its back at you. The Zinogre will quickly swipe at the ground with its paw before leaping into the air and slamming down upon you. This mechanic serves two purposes: to bypass the problem with telegraphed attacks, and to mimic an animal's warning sign. Like a dog's growl or a cat's hiss, these attacks are the monster's way of telling you to back off, to encourage a gameplay dynamic where you stop attacking and prepare for their big hit, or perish. You are practicing the ethical hunting aspect of respect for the hunt. You are encouraged to respect these warning signs. You are encouraged to respect the hunt this way. A core tenet of ethical hunting. Monster Hunter World's monster designs display both clear and subtle recurring pieces of detail that plays into a monster's weight and shape. This element, this mechanic of design, conditions players to think about how their hunt may move around based on prior hunts, which encourages the ethical hunting practice of remaining knowledgeable about the game. Weight in animation and posing pertains to how an object's size and shape influences its gravity, and this is considered a fundamental part of the developer's design for monsters. Monsters with bigger, bulkier tails like the Glavenus have larger, wider swings to balance and make use of its heavy weight, while monsters with thinner, lighter tails like Velkhana have better control and can make more precise movements with it. Not only that, but monsters with similar models like the Paolumu and the Puke can share similar attacks like tail spins. This subtle detail encourages a dynamic where the player considers how the monsters move before getting neck deep into the hunt, inspiring an aesthetic of feeling knowledgeable, another core tenet of ethical hunting. Lastly, and most importantly, Monster Hunter World does not allow the player to see the monster's health bar, instead opting to show visual damages on the monster through the part break mechanic. This serves two purposes: to discourage players from getting too greedy and disrespecting the hunt, and to mimic the practice of efficient shot placement. Aside from some vague and inconsistent icons, you will never be able to tell exactly how much health a monster has. This intentional lack of information serves the simple purpose of preventing a dynamic where the player knows they can get greedy, and knows that all it takes is just one last hit to complete the quest. Instead, you must rely on looking at the physical scars and damages on the monster that you yourself have created. This is the part break mechanic, where focusing on damaging certain parts of a monster breaks them, and the game utilizes many mechanics to encourage a dynamic of going for part breaks through a multitude of feedback loops. Participating in the part break mechanic will reward you with more parts and an increased chance at rare parts, weakening certain attacks, and knowing a little more accurately how close you are at completing the hunt. Already, this mechanic alone encourages a practice similar to efficient shot placement by inspiring a dynamic where you are carefully considering where to focus your attacks. However, this goes much further by inspiring a positive feedback loop through experimenting with a multitude of intersecting elements and mechanics to quicken part breaking. In the paid DLC Iceborne, certain weapons can tenderize parts of a monster so that specific areas receive more damage. Every weapon type encourages aiming for different parts of a monster, and sharp weapons can even completely cut off the tail, while blunt weapons can concuss and stun the head. The gun lance can place a bomb on the monster for extra damage, but it only explodes if you focus on that specific area. All of these mechanics encourage a dynamic of carefully thinking about where your attacks will hit, and creates the aesthetic of feeling efficient, of practicing efficient shot placement like in ethical hunting. Through Hunicke's MDA framework, we can begin to notice how the mechanics of Monster Hunter World influences the dynamic and aesthetic of the player into practicing ethical hunting. Monsters have a mechanic where they use smaller attacks to warn hunters about larger ones, which pushes for the dynamic for hunters to back off, which in turn leads into the aesthetic of respect. Monsters have a design that realistically displays subtle weight and have shared similarities, creating a dynamic that forces hunters to think back to previous hunts and to remain knowledgeable. And lastly, Monster Hunter World's diegetic approach to monster health prevents a dynamic where hunters can get greedy, and inspires a dynamic that encourages efficient hit placement through its part break system. All of these parts make up a whole where players are conditioned into a playstyle similar to the practices of an ethical hunter. This has been Tammy, and thank you for watching.